the media, and indeed democracy itself. Quantum computing could destroy cybersecurity and increase the risk of malfunctions to complex systems. We don't have the beginnings of a global architecture to deal with any of these. Excellencies, progress on these issues and more is being held hostage by geopolitical tensions. Our world is in peril and paralyzed. Geopolitical divides are undermining the work of the Security Council, undermining international law, undermining trust and people's faith in democratic institutions, undermining all forms of international cooperation. We cannot go on like this. Even the various groupings set up outside the multilateral system by some members of the international community have fallen into the trap of geopolitical divides, like in the G20. Geopolitical divides are undermining the work of the Security Council towards a G2 world. Now we risk ending up with a G-nothing. No cooperation, no dialogue, no collective problem solving. But the reality is that we live in a world where the logic of cooperation and dialogue is the only path forward. No power or group alone can call the shots. No major global challenge can be solved with a coalition of the willing. We need a coalition of the world.
Excellencies, today I want to outline 3 areas where the coalition of the world must urgently overcome divisions and act together. It starts with a core mission of the United Nations, achieving and sustaining peace. Much of the world's attention remains focused on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The war has unleashed widespread destruction, with massive violations of human rights and international humanitarian law. The latest reports on burial sites in Izium are extremely disturbing. The fighting has claimed thousands of lives, millions have been displaced, billions across the world are affected. We are seeing the threat of dangerous divisions between West and South. The risks to global peace and security are immense. We must keep working for peace in line with the United Nations Charter and international law. At the same time, conflicts and humanitarian crises are spreading, often far from the spotlight. The funding gap for a global humanitarian appeal stands at $32 billion, the widest gap ever. Upheaval abounds. In Afghanistan, the economy is in ruins. Over half of all Afghans face extreme levels of hunger, while human rights, particularly the rights of women and girls, are being trampled. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, armed groups in the east are terrorizing civilians and inflaming regional tensions. In the Horn of Africa, an unprecedented drought is threatening the lives and livelihoods of 22 million people. In Ethiopia, fighting has resumed, underscoring the need for the parties to immediately cease hostilities and return to the peace table. In Haiti, gangs are destroying the very building blocks of society. In Libya, divisions continue to jeopardize the country. In Iraq, ongoing talents under the occupation continue as prospects for peace based on a 2-state solution grow ever more distant. In Myanmar, the appalling humanitarian, human rights, and security situation is deteriorating by the day. In the Sahel, alarming levels of insecurity and terrorist activity amidst rising humanitarian needs continue to grow. In Syria, violence and hardship still prevail. The list goes on. Meanwhile, nuclear saber-rattling and threats to the safety of nuclear plants are adding to global instability. The Review Conference of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty failed to reach consensus, and a nuclear deal with Iran remains elusive. But there are some glimmers of hope. In Yemen, The nationwide truce is fragile but holding. In Colombia, the peace process is taking root. We need much more concerted action everywhere anchored in respect for international law and the protection of human rights. In this splintering world, we need to create mechanisms of dialogue and mediation to heal divides. This is why I outlined elements of a new agenda for peace in my report on our common agenda. We are committed to make the most of every diplomatic tool for the pacific settlement of disputes as set out in the United Nations Charter: negotiation, inquiry, mediation, conciliation, arbitration, and judicial settlement. Excellencies, women's leadership and participation must be front and center, and we must also prioritize prevention and peace building. That means strengthening strategic foresight, anticipating flashpoints that could erupt into violence, and tackling emerging threats posed by cyber warfare and lethal autonomous weapons. It means also expanding the role of regional groups, strengthening peacekeeping, intensifying disarmament and non-proliferation, preventing and countering terrorism, and ensuring accountability. And it means recognizing human rights as pivotal for prevention. My call to action on human rights highlights the centrality of human rights, refugee, and humanitarian law. In all we do, we must recognize that human rights are the path to resolving tensions, ending conflict, and forging lasting peace.
Excellencies, there is another battle we must end: our suicidal war against nature. The climate crisis is the defining issue of our time, and it must be the first priority of every government and multilateral organization. And yet, climate action is being put on the back burner, despite overwhelming public support around the world. Global greenhouse gas emissions need to be slashed by 45% by 2030 to have any hope of reaching net zero emissions by 2050. And yet, emissions are going up at record levels, on course to a 14% increase this decade. We have a rendezvous with climate disaster. I recently saw it with my own eyes in Pakistan, where 1/3 of the country is submerged by a monsoon on steroids. We see it everywhere. Planet Earth is a victim of scorched earth policies. The past year has brought us Europe's worst heat wave since the Middle Ages. Mega drought in China, the United States and beyond. Famine stalking the Horn of Africa. 1 million species at risk of extinction. No region is untouched. And we ain't seen nothing yet. The hottest summers of today may be the coolest summers of tomorrow. Once-in-a-lifetime climate shocks may soon become once-a-year events. And with every climate disaster, we know that women and girls are the most affected. The climate crisis is a case study in moral and economic injustice. The G20 emits 80% of all greenhouse gas emissions. But the poorest and most vulnerable, those who contributed least to this crisis, are bearing its most brutal impacts. Meanwhile, the fossil fuel industry is feasting on hundreds of billions of dollars in subsidies and windfall profits, while households' budgets shrink and our planet burns. Excellencies, let's tell it like it is. Our world is addicted to fossil fuels, and it's time for an intervention. We need to hold fossil fuel companies and their enablers to account. And that includes the banks, private equity, asset managers, and other financial institutions that continue to invest and underwrite carbon pollution. It includes the massive public relations machine raking in billions to shield the fossil fuel industry from scrutiny. Just as they did for the tobacco industry decades before, lobbyists and spin doctors have spewed harmful misinformation. Fossil fuel interests need to spend less time averting a PR disaster and more time averting a planetary one. Of course, fossil fuels cannot be shut down overnight. A just transition means leaving no person or country behind. But it's high time to put fossil fuel producers, investors, and enablers on notice. Polluters must pay. And today I'm calling on all developed economies to tax the windfall profits of fossil fuel companies. Those funds should be redirected in two ways: to countries suffering loss and damage caused by the climate crisis, and to people struggling with rising food and energy prices. As you heard to the COP27 UN Climate Conference in Egypt, I appeal to all leaders to realize the goals of the Paris Agreement. Lift your climate ambition. Listen to your people's calls for change. Invest in solutions that lead to sustainable economic growth. And let me point to three. First, renewable energy. It generates 3 times more jobs. It's already cheaper than fossil fuels, and it's the best way to energy security, stable prices, and new industries. But developing countries need help to make this shift, including through international coalitions to support just energy transitions in key emerging economies. Second, helping countries adapt to worsening climate shocks. Resilience building in developing countries is a smart investment in a reliable supply chains, regional stability, and orderly migration. Last year in Glasgow, developed countries agreed to double adaptation funding by 2025. These must be delivered in full as a starting point. At minimum, adaptation must make up half of all climate finance. And multilateral development banks must step up and deliver. Major economies are their shareholders and must make it happen. Third, addressing loss and damage for disasters. It's high time to move beyond endless discussions. Vulnerable countries need meaningful action. Loss and damage are happening now, hurting people and economies now, and must be addressed now, starting at COP27. This is a fundamental question of climate justice, international solidarity, and trust. And at the same time, we must make sure that every person, community, and nation has access to effective early warning systems within the next 5 years. And we must address the biodiversity crisis by making the December UN Biodiversity Conference a success. The world must agree on a post-2020 global biodiversity framework, one that sets ambitious targets to halt and reverse biodiversity loss, provides adequate financing, and eliminates harmful subsidies that destroy ecosystems on which we all depend. And I also urge you to intensify efforts to finalize an international legally binding agreement to conserve and sustainably use marine biological diversity. We must protect the ocean now and for the future. Excellencies, the climate crisis is coming on top of other heavy weather. A once-in-a-generation global cost of living crisis is unfolding, turbocharged by the war in Ukraine. Some 94 countries, home to 1.6 billion people, many in Africa, face a perfect storm. Economic and social fallout from the pandemic, soaring food and energy prices, crushing debt burdens, spiraling inflation, and the lack of access to finance. These cascading crises are feeding on each other, compounding inequalities, creating devastating hardship, delaying the energy transition, and threatening global financial meltdown. Social unrest is inevitable, with conflict not far behind. And it doesn't have to be this way. A world without extreme poverty, want, or hunger is not an impossible dream. It is within reach. This is the world envisaged by the 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals. But it is not the world we seem to have chosen. Because of our collective decisions, sustainable development everywhere is at risk. The SDGs are issuing an SOS. Even the most fundamental goals on poverty, hunger, and education are going into reverse. More people are poor, more people are hungry, more people are being denied health care and education. Gender equality is going backwards, and women's lives are getting worse, from poverty to choices around sexual and reproductive health to their personal security. Excellencies, developing countries are getting hit from all sides, and we need concerted action. Today, I'm calling for the launch of an SDG stimulus led by the G20 to massively boost sustainable development for developing countries. The upcoming G20 summit in Bali is the place to start. This SDG stimulus has 4 components. First, multilateral development banks, the World Bank and regional counterparts must increase concessional funding to developing countries linked to investments in the Sustainable Development Goals. And the banks themselves need more finance immediately. And then they need to lift their borrowing conditions and increase their appetite for risk so the funds reach all countries in need. Developing countries, particularly small island developing states, face too many obstacles in accessing the finance they need to invest in their people and their future. Second, debt relief. The debt service suspension initiative should be extended and enhanced. But we also need an effective mechanism of debt relief for developing countries, including middle-income countries in debt distress. Creditors should consider debt reduction mechanisms, such as debt climate adaptation swaps. And this could have saved lives and livelihoods in Pakistan, which is drowning not only in floodwater, but in debt. Lending criteria should go beyond gross domestic product and include all the dimensions of vulnerability that affect developing countries. Third, an expansion of liquidity. I urge the International Monetary Fund and major central banks to expand their liquidity facilities and currency lines immediately and significantly. Special drawing rights play an important role in enabling developing countries to invest in recovery and the SDGs. But they were distributed according to existing quotas, benefiting those who need them least. We have been waiting for a reallocation for 19 months, and the amounts we hear about are minimal. A new allocation of special drawing rights must be handled differently, based on justice and solidarity with developing countries. Fourth, I call on governments to empower specialized funds like Gavi, the Global Fund, and the Green Climate Fund. G20 economies should underwrite an expansion of these funds as additional financing for the SDGs. Excellencies, let me be clear. The SDG stimulus I'm proposing is essential, but it is only an interim measure. Today's global financial system was created by rich countries to serve their interests many decades ago. It expands and entrenches inequalities. It requires deep structural reform. And my report on our common agenda proposes a new global deal to rebalance power and resources between developed and developing countries. African countries in particular are underrepresented in global institutions. I hope member states will seize the opportunity to turn these ideas into concrete solutions, including at the Summit of the Future in 2024. Excellencies, the divergence between developed and developing countries, between North and South, between the privileged and the rest, is becoming more dangerous by the day. It is at the root of geopolitical tensions and lack of trust that poison every area of global cooperation, from vaccines to sanctions to trade. But by acting as one, we can nurture fragile shoots of hope. The hope found in climate and peace activists around the world, calling out for change and demanding better of their leaders. The hope found in young people working every day for a better, more peaceful future. The hope found in women and girls living and fighting for those still being denied their basic human rights. The hope found throughout civil society seeking ways to build more just and equal communities and countries. And the hope found in science and academia racing to stay ahead of deadly diseases and then the COVID-19 pandemic. The hope found in humanitarian heroes rushing to deliver life-saving aid around the world. The United Nations stands with them all. We know lofty ideals must be made real in people's lives, So let's develop common solutions to common problems, grounded in goodwill, trust, and the rights shared by every human being. Let's work as one, a coalition of the world, as United Nations. Thank you.
I thank the Secretary General. The Assembly will now turn to Agenda Item 8, entitled General Debate. Mr. Secretary General, distinguished heads of state and government, excellencies, friends, the world needs solutions through solidarity, sustainability, and science. Solutions because we have drafted many treaties, set excellent goals, yet have taken too little action. We need solidarity because inequalities have reached record heights. We need sustainability because we owe it to our children to leave behind a livable world. We need science because it offers us neutral evidence for our actions. My sincere gratitude goes to all member states, especially to Hungary and the Eastern European Group for giving me the mandate to turn this motto into reality. Excellencies, we gather today at the most consequential moment of the last 4 decades. Des chaleurs extrêmes aux inondations dévastatrices.
Extreme flooding, extreme heat, climate change is shared by our communities. Our consumption and our means of production are tearing our planet apart from the earth to the sky. We are living in an ongoing state of humanitarian crisis.
أكثر من 300 مليون شخص في حال.
More than 300 million people urgently need humanitarian assistance and protection. And this is an increase of 10% since last January. The world food crisis has reached an alarming level because of climate change, conflict, and the COVID-19 pandemic.
الأشهر الستة الماضية دفع تضخم أسعار الغذاء والطاقة.
The food and the energy crisis have pushed at least 70 million people into poverty. Inflation, in the meantime, is at the highest level for over the past 40 years. 1/4 of the entire population of the planet is living in conflict areas, in areas where armed hostilities take place or where there is political instability. Violence has rarely been as harsh throughout the world before.
Have imagined that war would return to Europe, that the nuclear threat would be back in political discourse to settle a dispute with a neighbor. It has been 203 days since the General Assembly adopted a resolution condemning the military aggression against Ukraine. Unfortunately, the bloodshed and the suffering have not stopped yet. In that time, the United Nations, as we heard, and its partners have offered food and shelter to millions of refugees from that country. A landmark agreement on commercial grain exports from the world's best breadbasket offers hope. Diplomacy is at work to release fertilizers so that the shortage we see today do not become the famines of the next year. UN nuclear inspectors are at one of Europe's key nuclear sites, preventing a possible catastrophe. Excellencies, the theme of our 77th General Debate is a watershed moment, transformative solutions to interlocking challenges. I stand in solidarity with the people of Pakistan, where devastating floods washed away hundreds of villages. You have seen the heart-wrenching scenes of devastation. This can be a window into our future. However, in tackling climate change, we have the solutions. These are rooted in the advancement we have made in science cooperation and climate diplomacy. But we have to want to put them in practice. The International Panel on Climate Change has proven an invaluable tool for supporting political decisions to combat climate change and to adapt to its consequences. We should consider replicating its success in the areas of water, energy, food, and biodiversity. This would give us a universally accepted scientific foundation for action. Once this high-level week is over, I plan to launch a series of consultations with the scientific community, asking them to help us, bringing the knowledge from microphones, from microscopes to microphones. The 77th session of the General Assembly will be key to preparing the SDG Summit in 2023 and the Summit of the Future in 2024. Next year, we will assess SDG 6 at the UN Water Conference, the first since 1977. This call could not be more urgent. Water is set to be the next major driver of conflict worldwide. The problem of water is threefold: too much, not enough, not safe. We have the chance to make a difference in the lives of 2.1 billion people who lack access to clean water. Let us cooperate to make the Water Action Agenda as transformational, practical, and actionable as possible. During this session, we will also assess the Sendai framework and come to conclusions to improve resilience against disasters. It is vital that these opportunities lead to substantive outcomes. The building blocks for transformation are at our disposal: the 2030 Agenda, the Sendai Framework, the Paris Agreement, the Addis Ababa Programme of Action, and our common agenda all point in the same direction. They describe the world we want and offer the avenues to get there. I'm encouraged that the Secretary General's proposals and the important initiatives by member states mutually support each other. The challenges are great and they are interconnected, but they are not insurmountable. Ladies and gentlemen, without universal respect to the rule of law, it is all too easy to rapidly slide into treacherous territory. As we all know, in time of crisis, human rights are the first to be compromised. When human rights are under threat, it is our smoke signal, our call to action. It would be remiss to speak of human rights without addressing a fundamental issue found to be lacking in most societies around the world. It is women's right. It is simply unacceptable that every third woman experiences violence in her lifetime. As we speak, half of humanity is all too often excluded from decision-making and leadership. But we need every man and woman to live their lives to their fullest potential. It is only by ensuring the inclusion of all, valuing the knowledge of all, that we will find solutions to the challenges we face. This afternoon's UNGA platform of women leaders, organized in collaboration with UN Women, may be an answer to this call. Women heads of state and government will offer their solutions to society's complex problems. Data shows that crisis response is more effective when women take the lead. I encourage you to engage substantively with this issue. It has to do with equity and equality, but above all, human dignity. Excellencies, in all these issues, in all our endeavors, I look forward to working closely with the Secretary General, the Security Council, the ECOSOC, and other key relevant institutions of the United Nations. I stand ready to support member states to identify transformative, impact-oriented, systemic, and sustainable solutions. I promise to cooperate with all stakeholders, civil society, young people, women and scientific community, to name but a few. UN agencies, funds and programs are critical to bringing our efforts out of this hole and into our communities. To deliver on the agenda requested by the member states, I count on your constructive engagement, cooperation, and mutual respect to each other. I emphasize that the revitalization of both the United Nations and the General Assembly must continue. Our ability to competently improve our organization will determine its relevance in the eyes of people around the world. I want to advance negotiations on Security Council reform. It is high time that the Council represents the world's population more equally and that it reflects 21st century realities. This is a matter of credibility to our entire organization and our multilateral order. Ladies and gentlemen, crisis management and transformation will require our consistent efforts, way beyond one session of the General Assembly. In that spirit, let me finish with some timeless words of wisdom about chances and the risk of letting them pass us by. Things get better when we make them better. Things go wrong when we fail to seize the opportunities before us. Our opportunity is here and now. Let us act. I thank you. Distinguished delegates, before giving the floor to the first speaker for this morning, I would like to remind members that the list of speakers for the general debate has been established on the agreed basis that statements should be no longer than 15 minutes to enable all speakers to be heard in a given meeting. Within this time frame, I would like to appeal to speakers to deliver their statement at a reasonable pace so that interpretation into the other official United Nations languages may be provided properly. I would also like to draw your attention to the General Assembly at previous sessions, namely that the practice of expressing congratulations inside the General Assembly hall after a speech has been delivered is strongly discouraged. After delivering their statements from the rostrum, speakers are invited to exit the General Assembly hall through room GA200, located behind the podium, before returning to their seats. May I take it that the General Assembly agrees to proceed in this manner during the general debate of the 77th session? It is so decided. Finally, I should like to draw the attention of members that during the general debate, official photographs of all the speakers are taken by the Department of Global Communications. Members interested in obtaining these photographs are requested to contact the Photo Library of the United Nations. The Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency Jair Bolsonaro, President of the Federal Republic of Brazil. I request the protocol to escort His Excellency. The General Assembly, I have the honor to welcome His Excellency Jair Bolsonaro, President of the Federal Republic of Brazil, and to invite him to address the Assembly.
Hello, testing the English channel. This is the English channel. Mr. Shaba Karosi, President of the 77th General Assembly of the United Nations, Mr. Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, ladies and gentlemen, heads of state, heads of government, and heads of delegation. Ladies and gentlemen at large, I begin by congratulating you, Ambassador Shaba Karosi, on your election as President of this General Assembly. You can be sure that you can certainly count on Brazil's support. The theme chosen for this general debate revolves around a concept that perfectly applies to the moment we currently live, a watershed moment. Mr. President, our collective responsibility at this general
gira em torno de conceito que se aplica perfeitamente ao momento que vivemos, divisor de águas. Senhor Presidente, nossa responsabilidade coletiva nessa Assembleia Geral é compreender o alcance dos desafios que compõem esse divisor de águas e, a partir daí, construir respostas que tirem sua força dos objetivos que são comuns a todos nós. A tarefa não é simples, mas, a rigor, não temos alternativa. Esse esforço tem de começar no interior de cada um dos nossos países. Antes de tudo, é aquilo que realizamos no plano interno que dá a medida da autoridade com que agimos no plano internacional. Deixe-me falar da perspectiva do meu país. Quando o Brasil se manifesta sobre a agenda da saúde pública, fazemos isso com a autoridade de um governo que, durante a pandemia da Covid-19, não poupou esforços para salvar vidas e preservar empregos. Como tantos outros países, concentramos nossa atenção, desde a primeira hora, em garantir um auxílio financeiro emergencial aos mais necessitados. O nosso objetivo foi proteger a renda das famílias para que elas conseguissem enfrentar as dificuldades econômicas decorrentes da pandemia. Beneficiamos mais de 68 milhões de pessoas, o equivalente a 1/3 da nossa população. Em paralelo, lançamos um amplo programa de imunização, inclusive com produção doméstica de vacinas. Somos uma nação com 210 milhões de habitantes e já temos mais de 80% da população vacinada contra a Covid-19. Todos foram vacinados de forma voluntária, respeitando a liberdade individual de cada um. Da mesma forma, no terreno da economia, o Brasil traz a autoridade de um país que, em nome de um crescimento sustentável e inclusivo, vem implementando reformas para a atração de investimentos e melhorias das condições de vida de sua população. No meu governo, extirpamos a corrupção sistêmica que existia no país. Somente entre o período de 2003 e 2015, onde a esquerda presidiu o Brasil, o endividamento da Petrobras, por má gestão, loteamento político e em desvios, chegou à casa dos 170 bilhões de dólares. O responsável por isso foi condenado em 3 instâncias, por unanimidade. Delatores devolveram $1 bilhão e pagamos para a Bolsa Americana outro $1 bilhão por perdas de seus acionistas. Esse é o Brasil do passado. Aprimoramos os serviços públicos com redução de custos e investimentos em ciência e tecnologia. Hoje, por exemplo, o Brasil é o 7º país mais digitalizado do mundo. São 135 milhões de pessoas que acessam 4.900 serviços do meu governo. O Brasil foi pioneiro na implantação do 5G na América Latina. Levamos adiante uma abrangente pauta de privatizações e concessões, com ênfase na infraestrutura. Concluímos o projeto de transposição do Rio São Francisco, levando água para o Nordeste brasileiro. Adotamos novos marcos regulatórios, como o do saneamento básico, o das ferrovias e o do gás natural. Além disso, melhoramos o ambiente de negócios, com a Lei da Liberdade Econômica e a Lei de Startups. Como resultado, criamos oportunidades para o jovem empreender e ter empregos de qualidade. Coroando todo esse esforço de modernização da economia brasileira, estamos avançando a passos largos para o ingresso do Brasil como membro pleno da Organização para a Cooperação e Desenvolvimento Econômico, a OCDE. Apesar da crise mundial, o Brasil chega ao final de 2022 com uma economia em plena recuperação. Temos emprego em alta e inflação em baixa. A economia voltou a crescer. A pobreza aumentou em todo o mundo sob o impacto da pandemia. No Brasil, ela já começou a cair de forma acentuada. Os números falam por si só. A estimativa é de que, no final de 2022, 4% das famílias brasileiras estejam vivendo abaixo da linha da pobreza extrema. Em 2019, eram 5,1%. Isso representa uma queda de mais de 20%. O Auxílio Brasil, programa de renda mínima criado no meu governo durante a pandemia, que atende 20 milhões de famílias, faz pagamentos de quase $4 por dia às mesmas. O desemprego caiu 5 pontos percentuais, chegando a 9%, taxa que não se via há 7 anos. Reduzimos a inflação com estimativa de 6% no corrente ano. Tenho a satisfação de anunciar que tivemos deflação inédita no Brasil nos meses de julho e agosto. Desde junho, o preço da gasolina caiu mais de 30%. Hoje, um litro no Brasil custa cerca de 90 centavos de dólares. O preço da energia elétrica também teve uma queda de mais de 15%. Quero ressaltar que o custo da energia não caiu por causa de tabelamento de preços ou qualquer outro tipo de intervenção federal. Foi resultado de uma política de racionalização de impostos formulada e implementada com apoio do Congresso Nacional. Em 2021, o Brasil foi o quarto maior destino de investimentos estrangeiros direto no mundo. Nosso comércio exterior alcançou a marca histórica de 39% do PIB, mesmo diminuindo ou zerando impostos de milhares de produtos. No plano interno, também estamos batendo recordes em 3 áreas: arrecadação fiscal, lucro das empresas estatais e relação entre dívida pública e PIB. Aliás, em 21, tivemos superávit no resultado consolidado de contas públicas. O PIB brasileiro aumentou 1,2% no segundo semestre. A projeção de crescimento para 22 chega a 3%. Temos a tranquilidade de quem está no bom caminho, o caminho de uma prosperidade compartilhada entre os brasileiros e, mais além, compartilhada com nossos vizinhos e outros parceiros mundo afora. É isso que vemos, por exemplo, na produção de alimentos. Há 4 décadas, o Brasil importava alimentos. Hoje, somos um dos maiores exportadores mundiais. Isso só foi possível graças a pesados investimentos em ciência e inovação, com vistas à produtividade e à sustentabilidade. Faço aqui um tributo à pessoa de Alisson Paulinelli, candidato brasileiro ao Prêmio Nobel da Paz, por seu papel na expansão da fronteira agrícola brasileira com o uso de novas tecnologias. Este ano, o Brasil já começou a colheita da maior safra de grãos da nossa história. Estima-se pelo menos 270 milhões de toneladas. O Brasil também, em poucos anos, passará de importador a exportador de trigo. Para o período de 22-23, a previsão é que a produção total ultrapasse os 300 milhões de toneladas. Como afirmou a diretora-geral da Organização Mundial do Comércio, em recente visita que nos fez, se não fosse o agronegócio brasileiro, o planeta passaria fome, pois alimentamos mais de 1 bilhão de pessoas ao redor do mundo. O nosso agronegócio é orgulho nacional. Senhor presidente, quero lembrar que, também na área do desenvolvimento sustentável, o patrimônio de realizações do Brasil é fonte de credibilidade para a ação internacional do nosso país. Em matéria de meio ambiente e desenvolvimento sustentável, o Brasil é parte da solução e referência para o mundo. 2/3 de todo o território brasileiro permanece com vegetação nativa, que se encontra exatamente como estava quando o Brasil foi descoberto em 1500. Na Amazônia brasileira, área equivalente à Europa Ocidental, mais de 80% da floresta continua intocada, ao contrário do que é divulgado pela grande mídia nacional e internacional. É fundamental que, ao cuidarmos do meio ambiente, não esqueçamos das pessoas. A região amazônica abriga mais de 20 milhões de habitantes, entre eles indígenas e ribeirinhos, cuja subsistência depende de algum aproveitamento econômico da floresta. Levamos internet a mais de 11 mil escolas rurais e a mais de 500 comunidades indígenas. O Brasil começou sua transição energética há quase meio século, em reação às crises do petróleo daquela época. Hoje temos uma indústria de biocombustíveis moderna e sustentável. Indústria que contribui para a matriz energética mais limpa entre os países do G20. Cerca de 84% da nossa matriz elétrica atualmente é renovável. E esse é o objetivo que muitos países desenvolvidos esperam alcançar somente depois de 2040 ou 2050. No ano passado, o Brasil foi escolhido pelas Nações Unidas como o país campeão da transição energética. Temos capacidade para ser um grande exportador mundial de energia limpa. Contamos com um excedente já em construção, que pode chegar a mais de 100 gigawatts, entre biomassa, eólica, terrestre e solar, além da oportunidade ainda não explorada de eólicas marítimas de 700 gigawatts, com um dos menores custos de produção do mundo. Essas fontes produzirão hidrogênio verde para exportação. Parte dessa energia 100% limpa abre a possibilidade de sermos fornecedores de produtos industriais altamente competitivos, especialmente no Nordeste brasileiro, com uma das menores pegadas de carbono do mundo. A agenda do desenvolvimento sustentável é afetada de várias maneiras pelas ameaças à paz e à segurança internacional. Erguemos as Nações Unidas em meio aos escombros da Segunda Guerra Mundial. O que nos motivava naquele momento era a determinação de evitar que se repetisse o ciclo de destruição que marcou a primeira metade do século XX. Até certo ponto, podemos dizer que fomos bem-sucedidos. Mas hoje, o conflito na Ucrânia serve de alerta. Uma reforma da ONU é essencial para encontrarmos a paz mundial. No caso específico do Conselho de Segurança, após 25 anos de debates, está claro que precisamos buscar soluções inovadoras. O Brasil fala desse assunto com base em uma experiência que remonta aos primórdios da ONU. É pela 11ª vez que ocupamos assento não permanente no Conselho. Temos buscado dar o melhor de nós para a solução pacífica e negociada dos conflitos internacionais, sempre guiados pela Carta da ONU e pelo direito internacional. O Brasil também tem um longo histórico de participação em missões de paz da ONU. De Suez a Angola, do Haiti ao Líbano, sempre estivemos ao lado da manutenção da paz. Também contribuímos para a paz ao abrirmos nossas fronteiras para aqueles que buscam uma chance de reconstruir suas vidas em nosso país. Desde 2018, mais de 6 milhões de irmãos venezuelanos foram obrigados a deixar seu país. Muitos deles vieram para o Brasil. Nossa resposta a esse desafio foi a Operação Acolhida, que se tornou referência internacional. Já são mais de 350 mil venezuelanos que encontraram em território brasileiro assistência emergencial, proteção, documentação e a possibilidade de um recomeço. Todos têm acesso ao mercado de trabalho, a serviços públicos e a benefícios sociais. Nos últimos meses, chegam por dia ao Brasil a pé cerca de 600 venezuelanos, a grande maioria dos quais mulheres e crianças, pesando em média 15 quilos a menos do que tinham antes, fugindo da violência e da fome. A política brasileira de acolhimento humanitário vai além da Venezuela. Temos também recebido haitianos, sírios, afegãos e ucranianos. Senhor presidente, o conflito na Ucrânia já se estende por 7 meses e gera apreensão não apenas na Europa, mas em todo o mundo. Quero, em primeiro lugar, renovar o agradecimento do Brasil aos países que ajudaram na evacuação de brasileiros que se encontravam na Ucrânia quando começou o conflito. Refiro-me especialmente à Eslováquia, Hungria, Polônia, Romênia e República Tcheca. A operação foi exitosa. Não deixamos ninguém para trás, nem mesmo seus animais de estimação. Diante do conflito em si, o Brasil tem se pautado pelos princípios do direito internacional e da Carta da ONU. Princípios que estão consagrados também em nossa Constituição. Defendemos um cessar-fogo imediato, a proteção de civis e não combatentes, a preservação da infraestrutura crítica para assistência à população e a manutenção de todos os canais de diálogo entre as partes em conflito. Esses são os primeiros passos para alcançarmos uma solução que seja duradoura e sustentável. Temos trabalhado nessa direção. Nas Nações Unidas e em outros fóruns, temos tentado evitar o bloqueio dos canais de diálogo, causado pela polarização em torno do conflito. É nesse sentido que somos contra o isolamento diplomático e econômico. As consequências do conflito já se fazem sentir nos preços mundiais de alimentos, de combustíveis e de outros insumos. Esses impactos nos colocam a todos na contramão dos objetivos do desenvolvimento sustentável. Países que se apresentavam como líderes da economia de baixo carbono, agora passaram a usar fontes sujas de energia. Isso configura um grave retrocesso para o meio ambiente. Apoiamos todos os esforços para reduzir os impactos econômicos dessa crise, mas não acreditamos que o melhor caminho seja a adoção de sanções unilaterais e seletivas, contrárias ao direito internacional. Essas medidas têm prejudicado a retomada da economia e afetado os direitos humanos de populações vulneráveis, inclusive em países da própria Europa. A solução para o conflito da Ucrânia será alcançada somente pela negociação e pelo diálogo. Faço aqui um apelo às partes, bem como a toda a comunidade internacional. Não deixe escapar nenhuma oportunidade de pôr fim ao conflito e de garantir a paz. A estabilidade, a segurança e a prosperidade da humanidade correm sério risco se o conflito continuar. Senhor presidente, tenho sido um defensor incondicional da liberdade de expressão. Além disso, no meu governo, o Brasil tem trabalhado para trazer o direito à liberdade de religião para o centro da agenda internacional de direitos humanos. É essencial garantir que todos tenham o direito de professar e praticar livremente sua orientação religiosa, sem discriminação. Quero aqui anunciar que o Brasil abre suas portas para acolher os padres e freiras católicos que têm sofrido perseguição do regime ditatorial da Nicarágua. O Brasil repudia a perseguição religiosa em qualquer lugar do mundo. Outros valores fundamentais para a sociedade brasileira, com reflexo na pauta dos direitos humanos, são a defesa da família, do direito à vida desde a concepção, a legítima defesa e o repúdio à ideologia de gênero. Quero também destacar aqui a prioridade que temos atribuído à proteção das mulheres. Nosso esforço em sancionar mais de 70 normas legais sobre o tema desde o início do meu governo, em 2019, é prova cabal desse compromisso. Combatemos a violência contra as mulheres com todo rigor. Isso é parte da nossa prioridade mais ampla de garantir segurança pública a todos os brasileiros. Os resultados aparecem em nosso governo. A queda de 7,7% no número de feminicídios e diminuição do número geral de mortes por homicídio. Em 2017, eram 30 mortes por 100 mil habitantes. Agora são 19. A violência no campo também caiu ao mesmo tempo que aumentamos a regularização da propriedade da terra para os assentados. No meu governo, entregamos 400 mil títulos rurais, 80% deles para as mulheres. Trabalhamos no Brasil para que tenhamos mulheres fortes e independentes, para que possam chegar aonde elas quiserem. A primeira-dama, Michele Bolsonaro, trouxe novo significado ao trabalho de voluntariado desde 2019, com especial atenção aos portadores de deficiências e doenças raras. Senhor presidente, senhor secretário-geral, senhoras e senhores, chefe de Estado e de governo, senhoras e senhores, neste 7 de setembro, o Brasil completou 200 anos de história como nação independente. Milhões de brasileiros foram às ruas, convocados pelo seu presidente, trajando as cores da nossa bandeira. Foi a maior demonstração cívica da história do nosso país. Um povo que acredita em Deus,